Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. You can figure out how to spell Daniel yourself. On my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is the beginning of an adventure series in the tradition of fantasy. Or you can find my serialized novel, which is free, called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. I am in the middle of writing the 16th. I just started writing the 16th chapter. That will be out in, I don't know. See, I try to get it done quickly so I can work more on it because I want to make sure I can get these out every single month until the end of this story. So I get it out. I'm working on it, and I have different pieces at different times. But you can check that out. That's for free. You can check it out on my website, on the blog, if you want to read it, or if you want to listen to it, you can find it on this. You can find it on this podcast feed, or you can find it on its own podcast feed. Our word of the week. We'll just jump right into that. Our word of the week is aurora, which is the dawn. Aurora means the dawn. If you know the word aurora borealis, it is the word for the northern lights, which I think you can see in multiple times. I think you can see at times other than the dawn, unless there's a different type of northern lights that I don't know the name of. But I think you can see it at other times than the dawn. But that's what... So aurora, if you ever hear that, it means the dawn, which I think is kind of a cool word. I didn't really know that until now. It's not a very complex word, but I didn't know it until now because you hear the word, and sometimes you hear a word, you never know it yourself, and then you finally understand what it is. So we are going on to part 2 of why you should know history, and I'm just going to have a quick overview of what I talked about last week, besides all the tangents I went on, which I wanted to go on because... You know, you sometimes you have an idea and you're like, oh, I want to talk about this idea. And if you don't talk about it right then, the idea just disappears, right? In some cases, the ideas, sometimes that wasn't the best choice in terms of a tangent. And in other times, I think last week they were useful. I think they were good. And I'm like, this is important information. I think this is something I've learned and I just want to share it. But what I talked about last week is about young people, right? I started out with young people. I was talking about how young people are gullible. I talked about how, in general, more gullible than someone who's older, who's 10 years older than them. If you hit 18, someone at 28 is generally wiser than you. I talked about how young people are gullible, how they can be indoctrinated, and everybody does indoctrinate your children. I talked about how if you don't teach your children, someone else is going to, and I think it's important to have a say in what they're learning and what they're doing and how they think, and then you teach them to think for themselves as they get older. I'm very much in favor of that. And then I talked about how there have been movements in history that kind of hijacked the young people, and they kind of invested heavily in the young people so that they could flip society. And then after that, just talked about, within our society we've neglected teaching history on a wide scale, and there are certainly people who love history, but there are many, many people who have no interest in it and who don't know it and don't see the benefit of knowing it. And the funny thing about not knowing history, and this is how it ended last week, is that if you don't know history, you don't know that you should know it. But if you know history, you know that it is important to know. Right? So that is the paradox, and I ended last week with this idea that you don't know what you don't know, and it's ironic that you can't know something unless you know it. It's odd to think about. So we are going to jump right into that. We're going to jump into continuing to talk about history. This might end up being 3. I think it's a really interesting topic. I've got a lot to say about it. I think, like I said, history is very interesting, and I think that anybody, even if you're not interested in it, should know about it so that you can be better informed, so you can live your life better, because I think it does do us a great service in helping us live our lives better. Help us create a better society, but I also think it helps us to write better as well, and that's why we're talking about it. So within this, it might be easy to get political, and I am not going to get political in this, and if I do, it'll be very mildly. It's difficult to stay out of politics these days because even our media, even our entertainment has been politicized, which I understand to a certain degree. Media, entertainment, books, television, things you do for fun are important. It seems like they aren't important, but they are important, and because they are important, certain people think that you should bring them into the political sphere, and you should use politics, you should use the government, because that's what I mean by politics, right? Use the government to do something about something, right? So since these things are important and since they can be used for good or bad, we should have the government involved. I'm not a fan of that in general, but I'm not going to try to get political, even though I just did. And I'm going to say, what I'm going to say is that we often simplify history, right? I'm not going to get political about who simplifies history, because I think this happens across the board, and I think it's even the case that I do it, right? Yes, I can simplify history as well. And like I said last week, I don't think I know history as well as I should. I just think it's something that it's a reminder to myself. And this podcast has always been something where I'm playing around with ideas, where I'm like, this is a really important thing. Let's take time to think about this. Let's take time to understand it. Let's take time to just talk through it, which I think is very important. So I think that we simplify history. We take one fact and we expand it into some overarching understanding of history, of reality, the reality around us. What we're doing is we're conflating that one thing to understand our lives better. A few things that I just want to point out, a few things that I'm like arching my back, it's hurting. A few things that I think we should understand when looking at history, okay? And when looking at people who are writing history, when looking at historical sources, when we're looking at how we read history ourselves, and when we look at what people are telling us about history, okay? I think these are very important things to remember, and I'm sure that you can find other things that are very important as well. The first thing I think we should remember is that everybody has biases, right? Everybody has a specific viewpoint. Everybody leans in different directions about different topics, right? That means that when I look at a piece of history, I need to understand, hey, what am I thinking? How do I live? What are things that I know, or what are what are ideas that I have? What are values that I have that that people in the past didn't, that these historians don't, that the writer doesn't, maybe the writer isn't a historian. What are different biases that are playing into this, right? I think this is especially true when you're reading the historian, when you're reading the sources from that time period, which may be the historian, and then your own biases, I think, as well. So people have biases. Everybody does. You're not excluded from that. The writers aren't excluded from that. Historians aren't. People from the past aren't as well. Here's another one that I think people forget. Not everyone has thought how people. Not everybody thinks how you think, right? Not everybody thinks how you think today, and not everybody thinks how you. And not everybody from the past thinks how you do today as well, right? So there have been viewpoints, there have been paradigms, there have been a myriad of understandings from, that's kind of a weird way to say it, from that vary widely from place to place and time to time. And I think we need to take that into consideration, right? We need to, there's been a push, I think it's probably just part of how people work. There's this idea of egocentrism. Egocentrism is this idea that you can't take another person's viewpoint. That's it at its core. So for little kids, and I've talked about this in the past as well. So if I have a little kid, and this pen is a little kid, and this pen is over here, right? So this pen is over here, and my hand is in between myself and this little kid. And if I ask the little kid what I see, the little kid will describe the back of my hand because they can't understand that I see something different than them. And this plays into how people work all the time. It's very important to try to understand that you are egocentric. Even if you're hyper intelligent, you're egocentric. You're making assumptions about the world from your perspective. It's good to understand that people have not always thought how you think. People have not always had the knowledge that you have. There's a big fallacy that plays into this, okay? There's a fallacy. It's called the Historians Fallacy. And there's the Historians Fallacy, I believe it's called that, is that people look back at history and they use the information they have, right? They don't understand history from the position of the people living that history, okay? And one big way this happens is the dropping of the nuclear bombs. right? People are like, why would people ever do that? Why would they? That's so evil. I can't believe they did that. Well, you weren't in that position. You weren't the people who were making those decisions, right? You have all the information afterwards. You saw what it did. You saw what happened after the war and everything like that. And you assume that you know enough to say, hey, they should have or shouldn't have done that, even though you weren't in that position. You didn't have the same, you probably didn't have the same information as them, because, the people making the decision were at a really high level in the United States government. They probably had a lot of intelligence about a lot of intelligence about a lot of different things, a lot of information about a lot of different areas. Also, they didn't know whether or not Japan was going to surrender. They didn't know whether or not Japan would fight until the United States had to invade the home island of Japan, right? That would have probably been catastrophic. But the historian's fallacy is that you're looking from your perspective at the past, and you have all this extra information. You're like, well, why didn't they do this? It's like, well, you weren't there. They didn't have this information that you had, and I think it's important to remember that if you're starting to look at history from your perspective and you're like, well, this is stupid, I can't believe this happened in the past. Well, you are looking from you're looking from the future with a lot more information. You can see how things ended up. So because you can see how things ended up, you can potentially make a better prediction of what people should have done if you actually have all the information. There are multiple different viewpoints on history, on certain aspects of history. There are, I think that the further in the past, I don't know. I think it's further in this case. I think the further in the past you go, things get muddier. Certain people in the past have there's a lot of muddy information about them where they're like piecing together information. Some historians might have a specific paradigm they're working from, which is going to change their viewpoint. And then some people who are writing about the events happening to them at that time might have a different viewpoint, right? So if you're you're a Confederate soldier during the Civil War, you're going to have a very, very different viewpoint of someone fighting from the North, right? If you're journaling, which would be a source from history. Or if you're a British royal, if you're a British, I don't know, I can't remember what the people are called who were living in the colonies and like the British, loyal. I think the British loyalists, that's what they're called. If you're a British loyalist, you're going to have a very different perspective about the Revolutionary War in the United States than someone who's anti-Britain, right? Who doesn't want to be a part of the British Empire. So there are multiple different viewpoints. There are an extreme amount of viewpoints in our present day. There are tons of viewpoints from the past as well. It's not necessarily the case that those viewpoints are incorrect, but I think we should understand that these viewpoints come into play when people are writing about history or understanding history. One thing about history that is another very important thing to remember is history can be pieced together like a detective putting together a case, or you're putting together a puzzle. So you have all these bits and pieces of information, right? If you go really far in the past, you find a pottery shard, or if you understand American history to a certain degree, you find the Clovis points, right? And you're like, oh, well, we have the Clovis points, and these people didn't have a written language, so we have to understand them based on these artifacts we found. Oh, we found that, I don't know exactly what the Clovis people had. It's like, oh, they were making pottery. Oh, they were hunting bison. I don't know exactly where they were, so if I'm incorrect, whatever. It's just to make a point. They were doing this, they were doing that. They buried their dead in really extravagant graves, right? In certain cases, I think with the Vikings, they have runes, but there's a less written history from the Vikings. And then you have them buried in certain graves with all these different things. And then you have these rituals that people they're taking all this information, right? And they're probably taking old oral tradition as well. They're taking all this information, they're taking oral tradition, they're trying to piece together what actually happened, right? They don't exactly know, but they're like, based on this piece of information, we're almost certain that this is how the people lived, or based on this one eyewitness account, we think this is what happened, right? So sometimes history is fragmentary. Is that how you say the word? Sometimes history is in pieces when they put it together, and other times there's a lot of information about what's being, about history, about these historical facts. But in some cases, in a lot of cases, especially if you go really far into the past, they are finding these little bits and pieces, and then they're building a. And I don't want to rip on historians. I think they do this in general. I think historians do a great job, and I think they do it in a very sober way, where they build out from that piece of information. They extrapolate. They're like, yeah, we really think this is the case, and this is why, and they have good reasons for it. And I think that sources, this is my final point, sources are very important when we're looking at history. But besides those pieces of information, besides these 5 things to remember about history that seem to cast doubt on actually knowing history, I think that historians can create fleshed out pictures of what's happening in many cases. And I think, like I said before, I think historians are really sober about it, and I think historians are very honest in general. You always have people who are dishonest. I think historians are very very honest about whether they know something for certain, or whether they're making whether they're like, we think this is the case. I think it's generally the case where they're presenting an argument. In some ways, this is very much like the social sciences. So the social sciences, and there are certain things that are very definitive in the social sciences, but there's a lot of stuff where people do studies and they don't have enough information, or they find something out. They're like, well, we think this is how the human mind works based on this one piece of information, and they can't see. There's not this little person inside the human mind, or there's not little bits and pieces of machinery that make up this one function in the human mind. But at the same time, they can say, well, because the human mind is abstract, that's what I mean. You could get into the neurochemistry and you could say, oh, this part of the brain connects to this, but how people function in the world, that what they're talking about is how people are working out their lives in real time, talking to other people, what they're thinking about, why they're making certain decisions, which decisions and thinking and talking are abstract things, and we need to know, what thing is happening inside that person's mind, whether conscious or unconscious, that is allowing them to jump to these conclusions, that's allowing them to live in this specific way, or it's pushing them to make these specific decisions. So social scientists do something similar in a lot of cases where they get this information, and if they're sober social scientists, if they're honest about it, they say, okay, we are pretty certain this is how the mind works. We're pretty certain that there's this thing within the human brain, or within humanity, where we can understand concepts in this specific way. I was actually just reading about babies, and there was something about babies. Now, what was that? If I can remember exactly. But babies, this isn't what I was thinking about, but for example, babies learn language. So social scientists are like, well, we believe there's this language acquisition device within babies, right? There's this, maybe it's a framework, the mind of the baby has this language framework. And what happens is the language gets laid on top of it, kind of like a cloth going on a frame, or I guess it would be like a tent going on a tent frame. So they don't actually know whether that actually exists, but they're like, from what we see, we're almost certain that there has to be something in the mind, even though we haven't fleshed out exactly how that works. Now, one question you might ask is, if understanding history is complex, why is it important to know, right? If understanding history is complex, why is it important to know? Now, do you know how a scientific experiment works, right? What goes along with that question is that, this history is so complex that even if I know it, I can't know it, right? And that's what I'm really getting at with that question. It's like, well, if it's so complex, maybe I should just give up, and nobody's going to draw specific conclusions about history. Therefore, let's move on. It's not that important, and it's going to take so much time to actually understand it. So when we look at an experiment, how an experiment works is we what we do is we control for everything but one thing, and then we move that one thing around. So one example of this is whether coffee helps with bowel movements. And this comes courtesy of, I have no idea. My wife was talking about some experiment or some person talking about, how can we find out whether coffee helps with your bowel movements, whether it makes it better or makes it easier to have a bowel movement. And one person's like, well, we could test coffee versus water. We could have somebody drink hot coffee and then have them drink hot water. And what the other person suggested is, why don't we have them drink hot coffee and cold coffee to determine whether it's just the hot water having an effect on the bowel movement and not the coffee itself. Now, what was happening is in the first instance, we could have a whole bunch of different variables playing into whether coffee actually helped with bowel movements or not, right? We had the water. There's the different viscosity of water, right? Than coffee, it's probably slightly less viscous than coffee. We also have whether there's minerals in the water that might help. There's different types of water. Does the water have fluoride in it? What does the water treatment facility do to treat the water? Or is it well water or different things like that? The water where I live has radium in it. That might affect it as well. There's so many variations in water, and I guess if you got distilled water, you'd take out those variations. But what would be easier is if you made a pot of coffee, and then you poured 2 cups immediately, and then you had 1 cup that was hot, and then 1 cup was cold, and then you had that person drink it, because you have the exact same coffee made at the exact same time, and you have the only difference between that coffee is one's hot and one's cold. And if you see a difference between those two things, or if you see a significant difference, you might say, well, we know that there is a difference between hot and cold coffee. Now let's test it between hot water and cold water and see if it's different. And in that case, then you'd get distilled water to determine it. But what you should see is that coffee, in general, it helps with bowel movements more, if it's actually going to. So you're controlling for as many things as possible, right? You're controlling everything, and then you are making conclusions based off those things you find. In some cases, the conclusions are very definitive. You might find that every single time between water and coffee, that coffee allows for better bowel movements. Sorry for the topic, but it was just on my mind. It's a very good example, and you'll remember it because it's about bowel movements. So you might find that coffee will always be a better bowel movement, whether it's hot or cold, or whether the water is hot or cold. Coffee always works better 100% of the time. We never ever have a time it doesn't. That's definitive, and we do it over like 1,000 times, 1,000 different people. That seems to be pretty definitive that coffee is going to help better than water in any state. So we're trying to control for things, and then we make those conclusions. Well, history is like doing messy research in some ways, and I don't want to use the term messy to say, history and people doing historical research are less than people doing scientific research. Like the reason why I have this podcast is to tell you that knowing history is very important, and the work that historians do is very important. So history is like being in a laboratory and doing messy research, especially if you're someone who's not a historian. People try things in a laboratory. We see the results. We try another thing. We see the results, right? All right. So one question that we come to is why is it important to know history? Okay. History is kind of like a scientific experiment. Okay. So with scientific experiments, we have all these different factors. We're trying to control as many of those factors as possible. Now, if the guy who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is correct, then we can't actually control all those different things, but that's beside the point. We try to control as many things as possible, and we change one aspect, and then when we come to a conclusion, when we find that aspect changes things, then we understand, okay, this is definitive. To help clear that up a little better, if you want to understand whether coffee helps with bowel movements, then you should you should compare coffee to different types of drinks, right? So you could have someone drink coffee and water at the same time of the day, under the same conditions, and you would just be changing the drink they're taking. So if coffee on every single one of those instances helps with bowel movements, then it would help show that coffee helps with bowel movements. Like I said, you would have to control for as many things as possible. So you would have the person do it at 8 a.m. exactly. You would have them have the exact same breakfast. You would have them eat the exact same food the night before. You would have them, you would have the coffee and you would have the water the exact same temperature. You would have them to go to the bathroom at the same place. You would have them do the exact same thing when they went to the bathroom. You would have them go to the bathroom for the exact same amount of time, etc. As many things as you can control as possible. And then you find out, oh, coffee does help, and we've tried this 5,000 times. So we are pretty certain that coffee helps with bowel movements. Now, history is kind of like being in a laboratory doing messy research. I'm not talking about historians, okay? I am not talking about historians. History itself, what has happened in the past, is like being in a laboratory doing messy research. All right, what happens in history is people try things, something happens, we get to see the results, or we get to see a piece of the results in some cases. We try another thing, we see the results, okay? We have seen certain things tried in the past. Okay, and we can see the results of these things that have been tried in the past. We have seen more centralized economies, and then from history we can see, did that work for them? Should we do that in our own country or state, depending on how your government system works? We have dropping the atomic bomb. Okay, did that work? Should we do that in the future? And I think the answer to that question is like, okay, we think it worked. We think that some people think that it wasn't necessary, but it did help Japan surrender. So it seemed to work. But at the same time, the world in general said, no, we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want to drop any more nukes on the world, if at all possible. We don't want to kill whole cities. So we had that. We tried that thing. We as the human race tried that thing. We decided that it's something we don't really like. We did have a Cold War, but nobody attacked anybody else because both sides were thinking, we don't want to get into a war like this. And then we moved on. We made conclusions from what happened in the past, and we apply it to ourselves in the present day. How the U.S. government is set up, right? The United States government was considered an experiment by the founders. It is, by a lot of people, still considered an experiment. Some people say that experiment is failing. I don't know about that. We'll see. I mean, all countries fail eventually, but if it was implemented the way that the founders wanted it to be implemented, right? Or if the core principles were implemented how the founders wanted it to be implemented, would it actually fail? I don't know. The European Union it's them trying something. The European Union was a collective group of countries that came together and they said, hey, we need to create an economic union to rival the Soviet Union. And that's why that came together. And it's kind of morphed into something else now, but it was an experiment to do that. It seemed to work through that. Some people think it isn't working now. I'm not making a statement on whether it does or not. I actually don't have enough information. Kingdoms, states ruled by kings were an experiment that was done in the past for a very long time. People in the more present days, most countries say, hey, we don't need a king or a queen that are ruling our country. They still have kings or queens who are figureheads, but they aren't ruling the country. So some countries are doing a figurehead experiment, saying, hey, should we have a royal family? And I think it's stupid, but that's just my opinion. Republics are experiments. Certain medicines were experiments. We gave people medicines, and even medicines we use today. There are medicines that were given in the past, and they had horrible results. I think there was a medicine that was given, I believe, to pregnant women, and it created birth defects in children. And they were terrible. And it was found out that, hey, we do not want to do this anymore. Some medicines we find, hey, these medicines work really well. And so we want to use those. Medicines that seem to work really well is insulin for diabetic people. We're like, yeah, this doesn't seem to have any bad effects. If we regulate it, if people put it into their body at a certain amount at a certain time when they have a high blood sugar, it's going to help them lower their blood sugar and actually stay alive for the length that a life should be. What other medicines we have that we're uncertain about is I would say chemotherapy. I think chemotherapy is one of those medicines that we're like, yeah, it works, but it sucks. And it's not something we want to continue to do if at all possible, but we'll continue to do it. So there are certain medicines that work really well. There are certain medicines that we're like, those don't work at all, or they have side effects that are horrible, and we're not going to do those again. And then things like religion, and it goes on and on and on. Anything we've tried in the past is kind of like a laboratory. The world is a laboratory. We see what's happening in the past. We see whether it worked or whether it didn't work, and then we move on. What has happened in the past is, Rome had a government, and you have the story of Julius Caesar, and then Julius Caesar was assassinated, and then there was the empire, right, ruled by an emperor. So what happened in Rome is they had a republic, and for a long time people were like, yeah, the republic's good, this is working out for us. And there was a certain point in Roman history where the people of Rome decided, this republic isn't working out. We see in the past, we see today that this experiment's not working out so well. We're going to move on. We're going to go forward from this republic, and we want this emperor now. We want it to be an empire. And in a lot of these cases, people make these decisions based on what is happening in the present day, right? They're not looking back at history to determine whether they should make those decisions, but we can look back at those historical facts and we can make those decisions. Being able to predict the future is really important to living your life. And if we can understand history, or at least a part of history, we can predict certain parts of our life better. It's not perfect, but we can do a better job of predicting what's happening in our lives and society in general. The more fully we can understand it, the better it's going to help us. The better we're going to be able to see whether this is analogous to what's actually happening in our lives. We can look at it. We can be like, hey, that's exactly so. This can happen in, if you read autobiographies too. There's something that happened in the past people wrote about. It's individual people making decisions. There's always this idea that if you want to be a millionaire, maybe you should do what millionaires do, or billionaire, you should do what billionaires do. Now, I don't know. I think it's probably the case that if you want to be a millionaire, do what millionaires do. Is it the case that if you want to be a billionaire, you should do what billionaires do? The issue with that is that the issue with billionaires is there's so few billionaires in the world that we don't know if it's just a fluke or not. Is it just the world lined up in a way, or there was just a window of opportunity that they seized that comes around once in a while, and it just happened. And they definitely put effort toward it. I'm not saying that, but it lined up perfectly to allow them to become billionaires. Even so, when we look at millionaires, it might be a survivorship bias. So survivorship bias is that we look at, what do these people do? And because these people do a certain thing, that we should follow them as well. Well, we don't see everybody who tried to be a millionaire, right? We do not see everybody who tried to be a millionaire. And with survivorship bias, we only look at the group that survived. There's this, I just saw this on the internet, it floats around the internet. There was in World War II, I think it was the British, they had planes coming back covered in bullet holes. And somebody listening has probably seen this. They have planes coming back covered in bullet holes. And some people were saying, hey, we should reinforce the areas that have bullet holes so there's not as many bullet holes. And one scientist said, no, we should reinforce the places that do not have bullet holes, because there's no bullet holes there. So if it gets shot there, it's going down. That was survivorship bias, where we're looking at the things that survive, and we're making decisions just based on those people that made it to the top. We're making decisions on how we live our lives based on the people that made it, as opposed to those that didn't as well. We need to take into account all the information. So looking at history can help us understand that more fully. But if we understand history more fully, using the same word over and over again, we can look and we can say, hey, is this the same thing as my life, right? is this the same thing as my life, or are there different factors playing into this? Or, hey, this person did this thing in their life and it resulted in this, but they don't have the same starting point as me. If you're one piece of advice that I give myself, and if somebody else was like, what should I do? Or if somebody else was looking at who to look up to as a role model, one thing I would say is that if there is someone who went to an Ivy League school and you did not go to an Ivy League school, I think you are playing in different games, right? They're going to give you different advice than somebody who started and they didn't go to an Ivy League school and they worked their way to the top without the Ivy League school. Now, could they have good information? Could they have good life advice? Yes, of course. Yeah. It can come from someone who never got a high school degree. It can come from somebody who is the president of the United States. Good advice can come from anywhere. But at the same time, if you're looking at somebody who went to an Ivy League school, they have certain advantages that are much different than where you're at, unless you're going to an Ivy League school yourself, right? Once you get into an Ivy League school and once you graduate, you have connections to people who are elite, people who have a lot of power in society, who can help you get connected to other places, connected into different jobs, help you push out books, different things like that. So one thing I say is, hey, if you want advice and you're looking to somebody who went to Yale, who went to Harvard, maybe you should take that with a grain of salt because they're not living the same life as you, right? If you are someone who is poor and there's someone who's a millionaire giving you advice, maybe you should say, I need to think through whether this advice is good for my situation. So you need to match your situation to that person's situation. If there's someone who has lived a life that is extremely similar to yours and they got from where you are to somewhere where you want to be, maybe you should take into consideration that person's advice more, right? I think you should weight that advice more than the other people's advice because that advice is going to be better. And we need to do that same thing with history as well. Because we may be saying, we see this thing in history, therefore I'm going to make certain predictions about the future and what's going to happen. Now, it isn't perfect, but an understanding of history can help. And that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to continue this discussion. I think there's going to be one more discussion about this. Next week, I'm going to talk about people taking pieces of history and they don't understand it fully, so they're making conclusions about history and the present day, right? They understand history very shallowly, or they understand a specific aspect of history in a very shallow way. Because they don't understand it fully, they look at our present day and they say, this is exactly like this part of history, which isn't actually the case. So that's what we're looking forward to next week. And that's what we've got. I will see you here next week. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things he's doing, creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.